In civil litigation, a legal right omitted from the written record is a right that effectively ceases to exist. While a flawed oral argument can often be corrected, a failure to plead a defense or a claim in the initial papers is frequently terminal. This is the domain of Rule 9 of the Rules of Civil Procedure. It governs the specific consequences of a party's silence, transforming a failure to act into a permanent legal forfeiture. Under the doctrine of procedural forfeiture, the law interprets silence as a binding waiver. Once the deadline for a responsive pleading passes, the ability to raise most defenses is extinguished by operation of law. Navigating this complex procedural framework is a core requirement for the Philippine bar exam and a necessity for trial practice. Success depends on identifying exactly which rights are lost through inaction and which survive. This forensic teardown will analyze sections 1, 2, and 3, tracing the interaction between the omnibus motion rule, the compulsory counterclaim bar, and the specific requirements of the default mechanism. Mastering these mechanics determines whether a case survives to reach a resolution on its actual merits or is dismissed on technical grounds before the trial begins. Section 1 sets the baseline for the omnibus motion rule. Any defense or objection not explicitly raised in a motion to dismiss or in the answer is deemed waived. This rule enforces procedural efficiency. By requiring litigants to disclose all defenses at the earliest opportunity, the court prevents the use of surprise objections to disrupt the later stages of litigation. However, the rule identifies 4 specific grounds that are not subject to waiver. These are the defenses that the court is required to recognize at any stage of the proceedings. The primary exception is a lack of jurisdiction over the subject matter. Because this authority is conferred strictly by law, it cannot be created or waived by the agreement or silence of the parties. A frequent bar exam distinction lies here. While jurisdiction over the person is waived by a voluntary appearance, subject matter jurisdiction remains an absolute requirement that the court can examine at any time. The remaining 3 non-waivable grounds are litis pendentia, where another action is pending for the same cause, res judicata, where a prior judgment has already settled the matter, and prescription, where the statute of limitations has expired. If any of these 4 grounds appear in the pleadings or the evidence on record, the judge is mandated to dismiss the claim motu proprio, meaning on their own initiative, even without a motion from the parties. While the omnibus motion rule penalizes the inactive litigant, these 4 exceptions protect the fundamental jurisdiction and consistency of the judicial system. Section 2 applies the principle of forfeiture to claims held by the defendant. If a counterclaim is compulsory and the defending party fails to include it in their answer, that claim is permanently barred from being raised in any future lawsuit. A counterclaim is classified as compulsory if it arises out of the same transaction or occurrence that constitutes the subject matter of the plaintiff's claim. Courts determine this using the logical relation test. The policy objective is the avoidance of a multiplicity of suits. The law requires the parties to resolve the entirety of their controversy within a single legal action. This creates a significant risk in employment litigation. If a terminated employee sues for illegal dismissal, an employer's claim for misappropriated funds from that same period must be raised in that same proceeding. Filing it later as a separate civil case will result in a dismissal based on Section 2. Examinees often incorrectly assume that they cannot file a counterclaim if it contradicts their primary defense. However, the rules permit a party to set forth 2 or more statements of a defense alternatively or hypothetically, even if they are inconsistent with one another. The only remedy for an omitted counterclaim is through Section 10 of Rule 11. By leave of court, a party may amend their pleading to include the claim if they can prove the omission was due to oversight, inadvertence, or excusable neglect. Effectively, Section 2 forces a consolidation of all related grievances, ensuring the judicial system does not process the same set of facts across multiple disconnected trials. Default is the procedural penalty imposed on a defendant who fails to file a responsive pleading within the time required by the rules. It is a common misconception that this penalty is automatic. In ordinary civil actions, the court cannot act until the plaintiff follows a specific 3-step procedure required by due process. This mechanism requires 3 steps: a motion by the claiming party, notice given to the defendant, and proof that the defendant failed to answer. The burden of initiating this process rests entirely on the plaintiff. A judge who declares a defendant in default, motu proprio, in an ordinary civil action exceeds their authority and commits a grave abuse of discretion. This differs from the rule on summary procedure and small claims. In those specific cases, the court is authorized to render judgment immediately if no answer is filed, without waiting for a formal motion from the plaintiff. In ordinary litigation, default is a weapon that the plaintiff must actively wield. The court is forbidden from intervening on the plaintiff's behalf to silence the defendant. A critical distinction exists between an interlocutory order of default and a final judgment by default. An order simply marks the defendant's failure to answer. It is not yet a final decision on the merits of the case. Under Section 3A, the order of default strips the defendant of their standing in court. They are prohibited from presenting evidence, taking part in the trial, or cross-examining the plaintiff's witnesses. Despite being silenced, the defendant retains their right to due process. They are still entitled to receive notice of all subsequent proceedings and to receive copies of all orders and judgments issued by the court. To regain their standing, the defendant must use the procedural remedy found in Section 3B, the motion to set aside the order of default. The timing of this motion is strict. It must be filed after the discovery of the default, but before the court renders a final judgment. Successfully lifting the order requires meeting a dual evidence burden. The defendant must prove that their failure to answer was due to fraud, accident, mistake, or excusable negligence, and they must attach an affidavit of merit demonstrating a valid defense. Satisfying both requirements is the only way to restore the defendant's standing. The order of default creates a temporary paralysis of the defendant's case. Failure to execute these specific requirements before the judgment is rendered makes that paralysis permanent. Section 3C governs partial default. This occurs in lawsuits involving multiple defendants, where some parties file an answer while others remain silent. If defendants share a common cause of action, the court cannot render conflicting judgments. Instead, it must try the case against all defendants together. This creates a protective effect. If an answering defendant proves a defense that applies to the entire group, such as proving the debt was already extinguished, that victory automatically benefits the defaulted defendant as well. For those who remain in default, Section 3D establishes strict limits on the relief the court can grant. A judge is prohibited from awarding an amount that exceeds or is different in kind from what the plaintiff specifically requested in the complaint. This ensures the defendant is not penalized beyond what they were originally warned of in the summons. Sections 3C and 3D serve as constitutional safeguards. They prevent a plaintiff from using a defendant's absence to obtain unpleaded damages or legally inconsistent outcomes. Under Section 3E, the rules of default are entirely suspended for specific actions involving the family: annulment, declaration of nullity of marriage, and legal separation. Because the state protects marriage as an inviolable institution, the parties cannot bypass legal requirements for dissolution by simply refusing to answer a summons. If a defending spouse fails to file an answer, the trial court is forbidden from declaring them in default. Instead, the court must direct the public prosecutor or the solicitor general to investigate whether collusion exists between the parties. Their role is to ensure that the evidence is not fabricated and that the state's interest in the marriage is represented. In commercial and civil disputes, Rule 9 enforces a strict policy of forfeiture. But when the foundation of the family is at stake, these procedural penalties are neutralized by the state's overriding policy interests. Rule 9 functions as a comprehensive filter for civil procedure, linking the waiver of defenses to the strict requirements of counterclaims and default. It ensures that only those who actively participate in the litigation process can preserve their legal rights. Success in litigation requires an understanding of what survives waiver, the specific mechanics of the default process, and the rare instances where these rules are suspended by the state. For the legal practitioner, the anatomy of silence in Rule 9 is a reminder that in the rules of court, a failure to speak is the most certain path to a permanent loss of rights.